For more than a century, millions have stared into the eyes of Nefertiti and believed they were seeing one of the most beautiful women in history.
Infatti sia in sua Nefertiti che vuoi a Sevilla tiene.
What a waste to be API.
Evoke a sense of ancient Egypt more than this. The face of Nefertiti. She was the wife of a pharaoh and the stepmother to another.
But what if the face that captivated the world wasn't the real face at all? A CT scan of the famous bust revealed something astonishing hidden beneath the surface. A different face carefully concealed under layers of sculpted perfection, almost like a mask. Why would an ancient artist alter one of history's most iconic portraits? And what do DNA evidence, forensic reconstruction, and chemical analysis suggest about the woman buried beneath that image? The answers point to a story so controversial that powerful people may have tried to erase it from history altogether. The most recognized face in ancient history. The bust of Nefertiti is displayed in the Neuss Museum in Berlin. It is protected by climate-controlled glass and attracts more than 500,000 visitors every year. The bust is one of the most famous images from ancient Egypt. It appears in textbooks, posters, jewelry, and many books about Egyptian history. Its long neck, high cheekbones, painted eye, and tall crown have made it a symbol of ancient Egypt, just like the pyramids. For many years, experts knew that the bust was made of painted plaster placed over a limestone core. However, they did not know what the limestone looked like underneath. This changed when a research team led by Dr. Alexander Huppertz at the Charité Hospital in Berlin used CT scanning technology to examine the bust. The scans revealed a surprising discovery. Hidden beneath the outer plaster layer was another face. This inner face looked different from the famous one seen by visitors. It had a sharper nose with a small bump on the bridge. There were lines around the mouth and eyes, showing signs of age. The face was also slightly uneven, which is common in real human faces. In contrast, the outer face looked smooth, young, and perfectly symmetrical. It appeared flawless and idealized. The differences between the two faces showed that the sculptor had done more than simply cover the limestone with plaster. Instead, the plaster was carefully shaped to create a new appearance over the original face. This discovery changed the way historians understood the bust. The inner face seemed to represent a real woman, showing natural features and signs of aging. The outer face presented an ideal image of beauty, with no imperfections. It was not just a finished sculpture, but a carefully designed artistic creation. The outer face can be seen as a mask placed over the more realistic face underneath. This was done deliberately by the sculptor. The reason for this choice remains an important question. Many scholars believe it may be connected to the political and cultural changes that took place after the reign of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, a period marked by one of the greatest campaigns of erasure in ancient Egyptian history. How the bust was found. In 1912, a German archaeological team led by Ludwig Borchardt was working at Tel el-Amarna in Egypt. This place was once the ancient city of Akhenaten. It was built by the pharaoh Akhenaten as the new capital of Egypt. Akhenaten created a new religion and wanted a city that matched his beliefs. The city was built in the desert, but it was abandoned only a short time later. Because the city was left so quickly, many buildings and objects remained buried under the sand. The ruins included workshops and storage rooms used by artists and craftsmen who worked for the royal family. During the excavation, Borchardt's team discovered a sculptor's workshop. It was believed to belong to a famous artist named Thutmose. Inside the workshop, they found many sculptures, models, and unfinished works. These objects were used by artists when creating official images of the royal court. Among all the objects, one discovery stood out from the rest. It was a painted bust of a woman. The bust was in excellent condition. The colors were still bright, the plaster was undamaged, and the crown was still attached. Most of the other objects in the workshop were damaged or worn, but this bust looked almost perfect. The quality of the work was also much higher than many of the other pieces found nearby. Ludwig Borchardt was amazed by the discovery. In his diary, he wrote words that later became very famous. He said that the beauty of the object could not be described with words and that people had to see it themselves. His reaction showed how impressive the bust was. One interesting thing about the bust was that it had no inscription. There was no name written on it. There was no cartouche, which was the special symbol used in ancient Egypt to show a royal name. There was no text anywhere on the object. Because of this, experts could not immediately identify the woman shown in the sculpture. Over many years, scholars compared the bust with other images from the same period. Some of those images had labels and names. Through careful study, they finally agreed that the bust represented Queen Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten. This conclusion took decades of research before it became widely accepted. The lack of an inscription was unusual, but it was not completely strange. The bust may have been a workshop model rather than a finished monument. Artists often used such models while creating official sculptures, and these objects were not always labeled. The missing inscription may also explain why the bust survived. After Akhenaten's death, many people tried to erase his memory and the memory of his religious reforms. Statues, inscriptions, and images connected to his rule were destroyed across Egypt. This campaign damaged many objects from the Amarna period. However, the bust was hidden in a buried workshop and had no name written on it. Because of this, the people destroying Amarna artworks did not recognize it as an important target. As a result, one of the most famous faces of the ancient world survived. The bust remained hidden for centuries and was preserved simply because nobody knew it was there. What the CT scan actually revealed. The CT scanning project that produced the inner face discovery was not initiated to find a hidden face. It was part of a broader scientific examination of the bust's materials and construction techniques. The researchers were interested in understanding how the sculptor had worked, what materials had been used, and what the relationship between the plaster surface and the limestone core looked like in technical detail. What the scans produced exceeded the project's original scope. The three-dimensional images of the inner limestone face showed not a rough working model that the plaster had refined, but a fully finished sculptural work in its own right. The inner face is carved to a standard that would be exhibition quality on its own. It is not a sketch for the plaster version. It is a completed portrait, and the plaster face placed over it is a different portrait. The specific differences between the two faces are worth examining closely because they carry implications for what each face was intended to do. The inner face's nose has a natural irregularity, a slight bump that is visible only in the CT data because the plaster smoothed it away. This kind of individual nasal variation is common in real faces and almost never appears in ancient Egyptian official portraiture, which valued idealized symmetry over individual accuracy. Someone bothered to carve it accurately in the limestone, and then someone covered it with plaster that replaced it with a smooth, perfect nose. The facial lines around the eyes and mouth in the inner face indicate a woman in her 30s or 40s, not a young woman. Egyptian official portraiture almost universally presented royal figures as youthful regardless of their actual age. The convention was not to deceive, but to represent the ideal rather than the specific. The inner face violates this convention. It shows age. The plaster face does not. The slight asymmetry between the left and right sides of the inner face is the detail that most clearly marks it as a study from life. Real faces are asymmetrical. Idealized faces are not. The sculptor who carved the inner limestone face either worked from direct observation of the subject or worked from an earlier study that itself was done from life. The sculptor who applied the plaster and built the outer face was working to a different brief. The political context. Understanding why the bust has two faces requires understanding what Nefertiti was and what she was required to be. She was not simply a royal wife. She was the public face of one of the most radical political and religious revolutions in ancient Egyptian history, a revolution that dismantled the existing religious establishment, demolished the power of the priestly class, banned the worship of every god except one, abandoned the old capital, and built a new city in the desert to house a new ideology. Akhenaten's revolution was built on the worship of the Aten, the sun disk, as the sole divine power in the universe. Every other deity that Egyptian religion had accumulated over 3,000 years was declared false. The temples of Amun, the dominant god whose priests had accumulated wealth and influence approaching that of the pharaoh himself, were closed. The statues were defaced. The festivals were cancelled. The priestly class that had governed much of Egypt's spiritual and economic life was stripped of its function. This was not a popular reform. It was an imposed revolution maintained by the authority of a pharaoh whose ideology was shared by very few of the people required to live under it. The population had worshipped their gods for generations. The priestly class whose income and status the revolution had destroyed was waiting for the moment to reverse it. The aristocracy whose relationships with the old religious establishment had given them political security was watching the new order with hostility. In this context, Nefertiti was not primarily a queen. She was an instrument of state legitimacy. She appeared in official reliefs performing functions previously reserved exclusively for pharaohs. She was depicted striking enemies with a mace, a standard pharaonic image. She performed religious rituals on equal footing with Akhenaten. She was co-ruler in functional terms, even if the formal title varied across different phases of the reign. The official image of Nefertiti was inseparable from the credibility of the revolution she embodied. The bust was a sculptor's master template. It was the standard from which official images would be copied across the empire. Every relief, every statue, every painted surface that showed the queen's face was supposed to look like this face. The face on the outside of the bust, smooth and perfect and eternally young, was not a portrait. It was a political specification. It told every sculptor in Egypt what the queen was required to look like in official contexts. The inner face told the head sculptor what she actually looked like so that he could produce the mask accurately. The disappearance. Around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappears from the official record. Not dies, not retires, not is recorded as having done anything at all. Disappears. One of the most prominent figures in Egyptian official art, depicted constantly across nearly every major monument of the Amarna period, simply stops appearing. The reliefs continue. The inscriptions continue. The administrative record continues. Nefertiti is not in them. More specifically, her name is not in them. Across multiple temple sites and official monuments, her name has been chiseled out with the systematic thoroughness that indicates a deliberate program rather than localized damage. The erasure was not complete enough to remove every trace, which is why modern scholarship knows it happened. But it was thorough enough to make it clear that someone invested considerable effort and authority in removing her from the record. At approximately the same time that Nefertiti disappears, a new name begins appearing in official contexts. The name is Neferuaten, a name that can be read as an extension of Nefertiti's own royal name. The grammatical markers used in inscriptions referring to Neferuaten are consistently feminine. The epithets used are those previously associated with Nefertiti, rather than with Akhenaten. The scholar James Allen and others have built a case which has achieved significant but not universal acceptance in Egyptology, that Nefertiti did not disappear from power. She was renamed and elevated. She became pharaoh under a new identity after Akhenaten's death and before the accession of Tutankhamun, ruling in the brief interregnum that the official record has always been slightly inconsistent in accounting for. If this reading is correct, the erasure of Nefertiti's name was not a punishment. It was a precaution taken after her rule ended, by the forces that reversed the Amarna revolution and restored the old religious order, to remove any trace of a woman who had been the face of the ideology they were dismantling. The Boy King's borrowed legacy. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922 and famous for its extraordinary contents, has a problem that has been noted by Egyptologists since the initial excavation, but has never been fully resolved. Many of the objects inside the tomb show signs of modification. Names have been gouged out and re-engraved. Pronouns that were originally feminine have been overwritten with masculine forms. Cartouches that were inscribed for one person have been altered to read as another person's cartouche. The modification work is not random or scattered. It is concentrated in specific categories of objects, and it follows a consistent direction. Items that were made for a woman have been converted for use by a man. Some of the modifications are detailed enough to have required skilled craftsmen working deliberately on finished objects. Others are crude, done quickly, leaving traces of the original underneath that conservation work, and modern imaging have been able to recover. The most likely explanation, and the one that fits both the physical evidence and the broader political context, is that many of the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb were originally made for Nefertiti during her years as the dominant royal figure of the Amarna court, and were repurposed for the Boy King after her erasure. The gold, the furniture, the ceremonial objects, the ritual equipment, all of it was produced in quantity for the most powerful figure of the Amarna period. When that figure was erased, the objects she had commissioned and that had been made to her specifications could not simply be discarded. They were modified and reassigned. Tutankhamun died young, probably around 18 or 19 years old, and his tomb shows signs of having been assembled in haste. The antechamber where Carter first broke through was packed with objects stacked and arranged with less care than would be expected for a carefully planned royal burial. The theory advanced by Nicholas Reeves, among others, is that Tutankhamun was originally buried in the antechamber of a tomb that was already prepared for someone else, and that the inner chambers of the same tomb contain a second burial, whose sealed doorways are still unopened. The body in the dark. In 1817, an Italian explorer named Giovanni Belzoni opened a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV-21. Inside, he found two unnamed female mummies, placed without the elaborate preparation and equipment that royal burials typically received. They had no inscriptions, no grave goods of significance, no identification of any kind. They were catalogued, examined briefly, and largely set aside. They remained in the category of unknown for nearly 200 years. In 2022, DNA analysis connected one of the two mummies, designated KV-21b, to Tutankhamun's maternal line. The connection was not to Tutankhamun himself, but to the mummies of two fetuses found in his tomb, infants who did not survive to birth and who were buried with him. The DNA analysis established that KV-21b was most likely the mother of those infants. Tutankhamun's wife was Ankhesenamun, one of Nefertiti's daughters. If KV-21b is Ankhesenamun, and if Ankhesenamun's mother was Nefertiti, then KV-21b carries Nefertiti's maternal genetic line. The forensic examination of KV-21b produced findings that are more disturbing than the DNA. The mummy shows severe physical trauma across multiple body regions. The arms are twisted backward in a position that does not result from natural decomposition or from the pressures of burial and time. The ribs show crushing consistent with compressive force applied to the chest. The skull shows fractures with sharp edges that indicate the bone was broken while it still contained living tissue, meaning the fractures occurred at or near the time of death, rather than after death and desiccation. The pattern of injuries is consistent with deliberate violence, not with accident, not with tomb collapse, and not with the handling damage that ancient mummies sometimes show from rough treatment during looting. Whether these injuries represent a violent death, injuries sustained during life that contributed to death, or something else that the available evidence cannot distinguish between, they are present on a body that the DNA analysis connects to the royal family of the Amarna period, possibly to Nefertiti's own daughter. The chamber that may still be sealed. In 2015, the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published a paper based on analysis of high-resolution scans of the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. The scans had been taken during a conservation project and were intended to document the paintings on the tomb's walls. What Reeves identified in the scan data were faint, linear patterns beneath the painted plaster that were consistent with sealed doorways, specifically with doorways that had been plastered over and painted to match the surrounding wall, making them invisible to visual inspection. Reeves argued that the patterns indicated two sealed entrances, one in the north wall and one in the west wall of the burial chamber. He argued further that the tomb's layout, which is unusually small and asymmetric for a royal burial, is consistent with a scenario where the tomb was originally designed and cut for a different occupant, where Tutankhamun was buried in the antechamber and outer sections, while the inner sections remained occupied by the original intended burial. His proposed candidate for the original occupant was Nefertiti. If she ruled as pharaoh under the name Neferuaten after Akhenaten's death, she would have been entitled to a royal tomb. The Valley of the Kings is where royal burials of this period were made. Tutankhamun's tomb, cut in an unusual location and of unusual design, may have been started for her and diverted when circumstances changed. Japanese ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2016 found anomalies behind the north wall of the burial chamber consistent with a void, potentially a chamber. An Italian survey team that repeated the analysis in 2018 disputed the findings, reporting no clear anomaly at the same location. The two surveys used different equipment and different methodologies, and neither result has been conclusively confirmed or refuted. The Egyptian authorities responsible for authorizing physical investigation of the walls have declined to approve any investigation that would require opening the plaster surface. The sealed chamber, if it exists, would likely contain either Nefertiti's burial or evidence conclusive enough to identify who was buried there. Either outcome would resolve questions that have been open for over 3,000 years. The refusal to authorize investigation does not itself prove that something is being protected. Legitimate conservation concerns about the tomb's fragile painted walls are real and well documented. The combination of the radar anomaly, the unresolved questions about the tomb's original purpose, and the refusal to investigate has produced a situation where the evidence points toward a sealed space and the access needed to examine it has not been granted. The daughters who were erased. Nefertiti and Akhenaten had 6 daughters. In the early years of the Amarna period, the daughters were depicted everywhere. They appear in family scenes on temple walls, shown with their parents in poses that emphasize the intimacy and warmth of the royal family. They were a visual argument for the human normalcy of the revolutionary regime. The family that worships together, shown playing and eating and praying as a unit, was part of the propaganda architecture of the Amarna period. After year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, the daughters begin disappearing from the record one by one. Not all at once, not with any announced cause. They simply stop being depicted, stop being mentioned, and eventually stop appearing entirely. By the end of the Amarna period, 5 of the 6 daughters have vanished from official documentation. The 6th, Ankhesenamun, is traceable because she became Tutankhamun's wife and appears in his tomb's decorations, but even her trace ends with a desperate letter she wrote to the king of the Hittites after Tutankhamun's death, asking him to send one of his sons for her to marry because she said she had no son and did not want to take one of her servants as a husband. The Hittite prince sent in response was murdered before reaching Egypt. Ankhesenamun then disappears entirely. none of the 6 daughters has a confirmed tomb. No mummy has been definitively identified as belonging to any of them. The systematic nature of their disappearances, spread over years and covering all 6, is more than the normal documentary gaps that ancient records routinely contain. It is the signature of a deliberate erasure, and erasure of this thoroughness requires both the will to erase and the power to enforce the erasure across multiple sites over an extended period. The biology of a dynasty collapsing. The political collapse of the Amarna dynasty was accompanied by a biological collapse that DNA and forensic analysis have documented in detail over the past 15 years. The 2 collapses were not unrelated. They were products of the same practices. A 2010 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association analyzed the DNA and medical conditions of multiple mummies from the late 18th dynasty, the period that includes Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. The study confirmed patterns of close-kin marriage across several generations, brother-sister or father-daughter marriages, practiced to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline and to keep power within the smallest possible family unit, had compounded genetic vulnerabilities across the dynasty. Tutankhamun's physical condition at death reflects this. He had a clubfoot that required him to use walking sticks, multiple of which were found in his tomb. He had bone disease. He had multiple malaria infections identified from DNA evidence in his tissues. He died at approximately 18 or 19 years old. His body showed the accumulated effects of both genetic vulnerability and recurrent infectious disease. KV21b, whose DNA connects her to his maternal line and who is possibly Ankhesenamun, carries a genetic mutation linked to connective tissue fragility, a condition that affects the strength and integrity of bones and blood vessels. This mutation, combined with the physical trauma documented on the mummy, produces a profile consistent with a woman whose body was already vulnerable to injury, and whose death involved injury severe enough to leave marks visible 3,000 years later. Chemical analysis of mummies from the Amarna period has revealed elevated levels of mercury, arsenic, and lead in the tissues of multiple individuals. The source is most likely the pigments used in the painted surfaces of the temples and palaces where the royal family lived and worked. Egyptian paint of this period used mineral pigments that included highly toxic compounds, and extended exposure in enclosed spaces with painted walls would produce chronic toxic exposure. The dynasty that had abandoned the old temples and built new ones covered in painted surfaces was living inside its own poison. The Amarna dynasty failed on every front simultaneously. The political ideology was reversed. The city was abandoned. The names were erased. The bodies show genetic vulnerability, toxic exposure, and in at least one case, injuries that suggest violence rather than natural death. The bust that survived it all survived only because it was unlabeled, buried in rubble, and beneath the notice of the people who erased everything else. What the face actually is. The bust of Nefertiti is not what the 500,000 annual visitors who stand in front of it believe they are seeing. They are looking at a mask. The mask was created by one of the finest sculptors in ancient Egypt to serve as a political template for the public image of a woman who was the living embodiment of a failed revolution. It was never meant to be a portrait of a real person. It was meant to be the official version of a real person, which is a different thing. The real face is the one the CT scanner found underneath. The lined face with the irregular nose and the slight asymmetry, the face that shows age and specificity, and the irreducible particularity of an actual human being who actually existed. The sculptor who carved that inner face looked at the woman, or at a careful study of her, and produced something true before covering it with something useful. The body that the DNA analysis connects to her family line, the broken body in KV21, may be the closest thing to the real woman that has survived at all. Not the face displayed in Berlin, which is a mask. Not the erased inscriptions across multiple temple sites, which are absences. The mummy in the unmarked tomb, with her twisted arms and her fractured skull, is the physical endpoint of a story that the official record was designed to prevent anyone from following. Modern technology is undoing the erasure in ways that the people who ordered it could not have anticipated. DNA connects bodies to families. CT scans look through plaster to find the face beneath it. Chemical analysis reads the toxins in bone tissue that decayed 3,000 years ago. Ground-penetrating radar looks through walls to find rooms behind them. Each tool pulls back another layer of the official story and replaces it with something more accurate and considerably less comfortable. The bust survived because it was anonymous and buried. The real woman it was made from did not survive in any official record. She was erased thoroughly enough that her name appears on temple walls only as an absence, the ghostly outline of chiseled stone where letters used to be. The mask survived the erasure. The face it was masking is the thing that 3,000 years of archaeology and a few decades of advanced imaging technology are slowly uncovering again. A CT scan revealing a hidden face beneath the most famous bust in ancient history. A name chiseled from temple walls across an empire. A tomb full of objects modified from feminine to masculine. A broken body connected by DNA to the royal line. 6 daughters who vanished without confirmed graves. A sealed chamber that may still hold the answer. The bust was a mask. The technology is removing it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next.